Hello everybody, and welcome to, this is our 5th webinar, Climate Focus in West Cornwall. And we're delighted to see everybody. Do put your details in the chat so that we know who's here. And also remember to put your questions in the Q&A and we will pick them up and for our discussion later on in the afternoon. You still have time. We sent out some feedback forms and you still have time to fill those in and let us know how you want these continuing webinars to shape up. We have one more in this series, which will be in July. We'll have a break in August and then resume in September. So the July meeting is going to be about education. It's going to be a discussion around the issue of teaching climate change into the core curriculum in schools. And we will have a speaker from Teach the Future, who's the organisation of young people who have written a Climate Education Act for the government to vote on. We'll also have Caroline Hickman from Bath University, who's a climate psychologist who works with children on their climate anxieties, and also Graham Plunkett, who's Senior School Effectiveness Officer in Cornwall Council, because Cornwall is very, very good in helping people to understand issues around climate change and to deal with them, to look at them in terms of challenges and opportunities. So that's for July. But for now, for today, I'm going to ask Julia Havard, who is our chairman for the day, to introduce our speakers and to take us through this meeting. So many thanks, and do put your questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Pippa. Well, today we're looking at nature-based solutions to climate change, and we're going to hear from 2 and possibly 3 truly inspiring women. Now, Melanie Coath, she is the Principal Policy Officer on Climate Change at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And Mel will introduce us to nature-based solutions, what they are, what are the benefits, where we can do it. Then Cheryl Marriott, she's Head of Conservation at the Cornwall Wildlife Trust. She'll talk to us about nature-based solutions here in Cornwall, such as tree planting, peatland, wetland, flood management. There's so many opportunities. We also have here Jenny Parker, our warden for the Rspb reserves here in Cornwall. Let me introduce you to the other people who you can see here, who are involved in these webinars. Obviously, you know Derek Thomas there. He's our MP for West Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. We have his business administrator, Megan McClary, who makes all this happen. You know Pippa, who's our WI Climate Ambassador, one of the climate ambassadors in Cornwall. I'll hand over to Mel and Cheryl in a moment, and after their presentations, as Pippa says, there'll be plenty of time for questions. But of course, today is a significant day because the Committee on Climate Change, as you'll have seen, launched its latest report on climate risk in the UK. Do look at their very good video on YouTube. The essence of that report is that the gap between the level of climate risk, which is right up there, and what we're actually doing to reduce emissions and to adapt to climate change, which is down there, and that gap is growing. The risk is greater. We are not on track to stop the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's really bad news. And the committee makes it very clear over and over again that nature-based solutions are absolutely critical to that. So on that note, let us begin. And Mel, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Julia. Thank you for that really nice introduction and great setup for my presentation. I'm on camera now, but unfortunately my bandwidth is low. So although I'd love you to be able to see me whilst I'm presenting, I'm going to go off camera just so that you can hear me clearly. So I'll stop my video now and share my presentation with you all. Can somebody confirm for me that you can see my slides there now?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, so I'm Melanie Coath. I coordinate the Rspb's climate change work, and my job very much focuses at the nature-climate nexus. You've heard already how important nature is in helping us to adapt to climate impacts from Julia's opening words. And some of you may also have seen another really important report that came out last week. Lots of important reports last year, but a really important one last week from the global climate science body, which is the IPCC, and the global biodiversity science body, the IPBES. And it's the first time they've done a working group report from scientists from both disciplines. And that really highlighted how the nature and climate crises are intrinsically linked, how we have to tackle them both together, and how we have to make sure that measures to tackle climate change don't undermine our biodiversity goals as well. So in looking at how nature can provide a solution for the climate crisis, it's not letting me move on through my slides now. That's frustrating. Let me come out of my presentation a minute. So I'll have to stop and reshare. I don't know why that happened. Let me just try again. Okay, can everyone see my second slide there with bluebells?
Still on your first slide, Mel.
There we are. We have the bluebells.
Yes.
You have the bluebells? Fantastic, yes. Thank you. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through what nature-based solutions are, where we find them, how we make sure that we get this area of policy and practice right and don't lead to perverse outcomes, things such as greenwashing, for example, and then how we can get the idea of nature-based solutions into both UK policy and also the international meetings that are taking place at UN level, which are called the COPs. And then we'll come to questions, I think, after Cheryl's presentation. So nature-based solutions, how do we define these? So we define them as nature's role in helping tackle some of society's greatest challenges. They might be environmental challenges, social or economic. And you can see on this slide, lots of writing, but just what a range of benefits nature provides for us. So it helps improve our air, soil and water quality. It helps us with managing flooding, with cooling our urban areas, with health benefits, be they physical or mental, with recreation, with amenity, and of course, and the focus of my presentation today, climate change adaptation and carbon sequestration, which is why when we are talking to government about a green recovery from the COVID crisis, we're talking about the very important role that nature-based solutions can play. In this presentation, though, I'll be focusing on the climate change aspects, but you can see the range of co-benefits. I do just really want to reflect on the language that we're using just briefly. So this is nature-based solutions. It's quite a new terminology, but it's not a synonym for nature conservation. So we still need to protect and conserve nature for its own sake to tackle the biodiversity crisis. But nature-based solutions, by looking at what nature can also do for us, as well as biodiversity more broadly, provides yet another reason to protect and invest in nature. So I think this is why people are really excited about it. We know we're not winning in tackling the biodiversity crisis, yet by highlighting all these benefits, we can provide governments with yet more reasons to invest in nature. And as I mentioned at the outset in the framing around the report that came out last week, that we know that the two crises are intrinsically linked and so must be the solutions. So in the Rspb, we've been looking at this area in quite a bit of detail. And one of the exciting projects that we've done is to map nature and carbon-rich areas in the UK. So this gives you a good idea of where our NBS can be found. So this piece of mapping work told us several things. So on the left-hand side in the green, you can see nature-rich areas. So this is areas, for example, in triple SIs up and down the country that are really valuable for species. On the right-hand side, you can see areas that are really, really important carbon stores. And of course, it's very clear to see the extent of overlap between them. In this piece of analysis, we found that ecosystems lock up carbon to the extent of 2 gigatons, which sounds like a very big number, but what does it mean? Well, it's equivalent to around 4 years of the UK's annual emissions, so really significant. We also found in looking at this that actually 2/3 of those high nature, high carbon areas are actually outside of protected areas and therefore are quite vulnerable, for example, to development by new infrastructure. So when we're talking about what these habitats look like on the ground, as opposed to on a map, actually it's a real opportunity for us to be inspired, because these are fantastic landscapes that we value for all sorts of reasons. And when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're talking about the benefits of protecting and expanding our woodlands, restoring our peatlands, recreating our coastal wetlands. And what our mapping work showed was how important it is to protect and conserve what we already have as a priority in policy, then also to look at how we can restore habitats to their former extent and also create new ones. Now, that sort of hierarchy is particularly important when we're looking at trees. So governments, as you will be aware, often jump on tree planting targets as a kind of key easy win to try and address the nature and climate crisis. And indeed, the political parties had a bit of a competition around the last general election in manifestos as to who could have the highest tree planting target. But we have to, of course, protect what we have already, the ancient and semi-natural woodlands that are so important for nature. And I mean, you'll be aware of the tensions and arguments around the HS2 development, where ancient woodlands are under threat from that. So we have to protect what we have. But in looking at new woodland planting, and I think this is something that Cheryl is also going to be highlighting, we really need to ensure that we have the right tree in the right place to deliver for nature and climate. So the right kind of tree species, appropriate native species, and delivered on lands that are not already important for wildlife, and also that are not already important for carbon. So if you plant trees on carbon-rich soils such as peat soils, you actually don't necessarily have a climate benefit. So it's really important to get that right. And talking of peat bogs are huge carbon stores. They are not in good condition at the moment, and their restoration is essential. So for decades and indeed centuries, we've been burning them, draining them, digging them up for garden compost, overgrazing them. So peatland restoration is essential, not least because they're a very substantial source of emissions. So if we restore them, not only do we have fantastic benefits for peatland wildlife, but we also turn off a really important emissions source. Coastal wetlands are probably less well known in their climate change mitigation role. One of my favourite facts, though, is that salt marshes can lock up carbon between 2 and 4 times faster than tropical rainforests, which is amazing. But they don't cover a huge area of the UK, so they play a fairly small contributing role to climate change mitigation, but they're really, really important for adaptation. So as sea levels rise, and as we have more frequent storm events and storm surges, they play a fantastic role in protecting the land behind them from flooding, from coastal flooding. And they're also incredibly important for wildlife. And for Rspb, they're some of the jewels in our nature reserves that are coastal wetlands, are some of the jewels in our crown, because hundreds of thousands of breeding and overwintering birds like to make our coastal wetlands their home. Perhaps less often considered in their climate change mitigation role are our grasslands. So if you think of the extent of permanent grasslands and the grazing lands that we have in the uplands, they're actually really important just because they cover such a substantial proportion of the UK's landscape. They have lower above ground carbon, but the carbon that's locked up in the soil of permanent grasslands is actually really quite significant. And of course, our meadows, we've lost huge amounts of our lowland meadow areas, but they're incredibly important for wildlife. I'm not going to talk about marine habitats now. Those are also really important, but Cheryl's going to pick that up in her presentation. She knows a little bit more about those habitats than I do. Before I move off inspirational landscapes, I just wanted to touch on this fantastic project up in the Cairngorms, a long way, I know, from where most of you are watching this from, but it's a really fantastic project, and I encourage you to check out their inspirational video on their website. So it's a project looking at restoring ancient woodland, restoring peatland and protecting water catchment areas. It's working with local communities over a 200-year time frame, and it's the doing projects at this sense of scale, I think is really exciting. So how do we get it right? How do we make sure that we have, you know, the Cairngorms Connect projects coming out of policy initiatives and not, you know, monoculture tree plantations, for example? Well, in the last UN climate negotiations in Madrid, the last ones that were able to take place, we were seeing fossil fuel companies coming forward and proposing tree planting schemes instead of you know, cutting back on fossil fuel use, which is absolutely not an acceptable way forward. And a number of us among the NGO movement and also with academic institutions like Oxford University got together to develop some principles for good nature-based solutions. And if you're interested in those, you can look those up. They are the NBS guidelines, and I can put the link in the chat later. But anyway, these principles focused on, well, first of all, the very important point that mitigation from ecosystems needs to be additional to, not instead of, fossil fuel reduction. It also needs to cover all ecosystems, not just trees, for the reasons that I've just outlined. It needs to ensure that investment in ecosystems leads to biodiversity rich ecosystems and not single species. So hopefully a picture tells 1,000 words here, and you could, looking at those two small inset pictures, it's very clear the difference between the top and the bottom. The bottom I took on holiday in Arran last year at this industrial forest plantation, partly just because I was shocked that it was so devoid of nature. And the fourth and equally important point is that we have to bring local communities with us. So communities here in the UK, but internationally as well, local communities and Indigenous peoples, it's incredibly important to respect their human rights, their land tenure issues, food sovereignty issues in any you know, ecosystem restoration projects. So how do we take these principles and this approach into policy? I've got two more slides. The first of these looks at UK policy. So there are a number of opportunities for advocacy to politicians at the moment. The first is around the government's strategy to get to net zero. So last year, the Committee on Climate Change advised the UK that it needs to get to net zero by 2050. So we are talking, we NGOs, Rspb and our NGO friends are talking to the government around the role that nature plays in that. And we've indeed commissioned research, independent research to back that up. And also we're looking at the role that nature can play in the UK's adaptation plans. In response to the report that came out from the Committee on Climate Change today that Julia mentioned, the climate change risk assessment, the UK government will be producing plans for how it adapts, and we want to see nature be playing that critical role. We also want to see the government implementing its new peat and tree action plans, well, that came out about a month ago. And we want to work with the Climate Change Committee to help them understand the latest science around nature's role so that they can be providing relevant advice to government. And the last thing that as Rspb in particular we do actually, and this takes up quite a bit of my time, is that we and I coordinate UK NGOs, different groups of UK NGOs working at the Climate Nature Nexus domestically, but also internationally. Which gives me a segue to my last slide, which is about international nature-based solutions work and COPs. Some of you will know what COP stands for. It's Conference of the Parties. So it's when ministers meet to discuss the UN conventions in these conferences, big high-level conferences. We have the climate COP in Glasgow in November this year, and a month before that we have the biodiversity COP in Kunming in China. So we really need to ensure that we have good decisions for climate and nature coming out of both those processes. We need to see those two UN processes being much more closely connected. At the moment, these issues are, despite the science and the framing that we started with at the start of this presentation, these issues are being tackled in silos. So we need those silos to be broken down. And as we call for nature's role in addressing climate change, we need to make sure that that's done in the right way, according to the principles I set out earlier, so we don't have opportunities for greenwash or negative outcomes. And finally, my final point just relates to the two photos at the bottom. There's a number of different approaches that NGOs take to trying to influence this work. At the bottom, I'm there with my colleagues from BirdLife International and BirdLife Spain, protesting outside the negotiations to try and encourage the decision makers inside to really increase the ambition of their talks. But also I work inside the negotiations. I'm presenting on a panel there about nature-based solutions in Madrid, trying to influence negotiators to take forward the kind of solutions that NGOs think will deliver ambition on nature and climate. And that is it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and do start thinking about questions and popping them in the chat, and I look forward to taking those after we've heard from Cheryl. Thank you very much.
Julia, you're muted.
Sorry, mea culpa. That's it. Mel, that was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Please put questions in the Q&A box there. Next, we're going to go over to Cheryl Marriott from Cornwall Wildlife Trust, who's going to deliver her presentation next. Cheryl.
Thanks, Julia. Is my presentation showing, and can you all hear? Great.
Yes to both.
Thanks. Excellent. Well, thanks, Mel, for a brilliant introduction to all this. I'll now attempt to bring that down to a Cornwall level. Although I see from the chat we've got people from outside Cornwall as well. But, you'll enjoy seeing what's happening in Cornwall. And I will be reiterating some of the points that Mel has made as well. So I'm head of conservation at Cornwall Wildlife Trust. That's one of our nature reserves there after a bit of woodland management. Moving straight on, Mel just mentioned about protesting. This wasn't so much a protest. This was in 2018. I was dressed as a frog, and that's Lizzie from Rail Holiday, who eco business in Cornwall, on the tube on the way to Chris Packham's People's Walk for Wildlife. Then a year on, here we are in Truro for a climate march, and this is just to reiterate that point that the ecological crisis and the climate crisis are interconnected. I think sometimes we can fall into a false sense of security in Cornwall because it is such a beautiful county, and we do have a good range of wildlife habitats and species left. But we've just published this, the State of Nature Cornwall 2020, and Cornwall is not escaping. Just like the National State of Nature report in 2019, we are seeing significant species decline here too. I'm not going to be depressing for the whole time, but this is something we need to face up to. There's some horrible figures there, things that we've been finding. This is looking backwards 30 years, and I'm all about now looking forwards. But nature is in decline in Cornwall for all of these reasons. It's how we manage our agriculture, it's pollution, built development, the state of our watercourses, and fishing pressure. And of course, add on to that now the impact of climate change. And it's no wonder that we've got so many species struggling. 30 or so years ago, there were 21 more species of breeding bird than we would find now in Cornwall. There's 4 species of plant which are no longer here, 8 species of bumblebee. We hear a lot about species decline and lots of numbers are thrown at us, but sooner or later, decline turns into local extinction. It's depressing stuff. It's a difficult read, this report, but I think it's something we need to be talking about and to redouble our efforts. This was a booklet produced by the Wildlife Trust. We have an umbrella body. We're a collegiate structure, the Wildlife Trust, and we've now got Craig Bennett, who was the chief exec of Friends of the Earth. He's now leading our national umbrella body. So he has an enviable task of herding the 47 cats that are the separate wildlife trusts. But he is bringing us all together on the climate change issue. And this is one of the results of that. A lot of the information that we're using for habitats comes from this Natural England report. I know you won't be able to see a lot of the detail here, but do look that report up if you're interested in how different habitats perform. Two graphs, again, you won't be able to see those, but this is to make the point, the difference between storage of carbon, and that's the top one where peat scores very highly for amount of carbon stored per hectare. The bottom one is habitats and carbon flux, so how much extra carbon is stored per year. And it's quite different. Peatland, when we're looking at how much extra carbon is sucked down by the plants in peatland each year, it's quite low compared to others like woodland. So this is really stressing Mel's point about we have to protect the carbon stores that we've already got, but we might be looking at different habitats for creation and restoration. Just to emphasise that, this is one of our woodlands, Kabila and red rice woodland. It's got parts of it are ancient woodland, so we've got to do our utmost to protect those sites. I like this. This is nice bit of standing deadwood. Okay, it's slowly decaying, but that's a carbon store, and look at all the wildlife that's supporting at the same time. Just grabbed me when I found that picture. Here's another one of our nature reserves. This is Hellman Tour, not far from Luxullian. It's high ground in the middle. We can see the China clay country in the background there. We've got this high point, the rocky bit, and then we've got this tangle of wetland and woodland around the base, 250 hectares here. It's an interesting site because, would you believe it, we have to clear some of the trees from this site in order to look after the wildlife that this is designated for. And that might seem a bit bonkers, but this is an internationally important site for the marsh fritillary butterfly. That butterfly needs open areas. Now we are looking at how we can start to use rewilding principles. Can we manage this site in different ways that are less carbon intensive and keep those habitats open? But it's just to show that by protecting some sites for their biodiversity, it doesn't always make sense from a carbon sequestration point of view. We're having to find a compromise. And this is from the State of Nature, just looking at a butterfly indicator. So looking at information on lots of different butterfly species. That's the paler blue line in the middle, which is going down. That's an indicator of what the butterfly populations are doing. The top darker blue line are the generalist species. So they're not doing so badly. They're the species that are less fussy, if you like. They can live in more general habitats in gardens. They can manage on our farmland as it is. The red line are the more specialist species that are more particular. So they're the ones like the marsh fritillary, for example, and it just shows again why we need to really protect some of these existing nature sites, because otherwise we can't hope to bring those populations back. Now this is from that nature-based solutions leaflet from the Wildlife Trust. I'm going to talk about some caveats in a minute, but it's showing the significance of nature-based solutions. When I spoke to Mel, she was suggesting we need to relook at that 37%, but it is a significant contribution. We will be reprinting that, or it won't be printed, I suspect it will be online, but Craig was very keen to make the point more strongly that emissions reduction needs to come first and foremost. Nature-based solutions are important and they have their place, but if we're not doing emission reduction at the same time, it's not going to work. Another point about nature-based solutions is that there is a finite amount of that work that we can do. We had some presentations as the Wildlife Trust on climate change, and someone was saying that the company Shell was looking at offsetting. They would need to plant trees over an area the size of Brazil. They will still soon run out of planet if we think that we can offset our way out of this problem. Another point is there's often a time lag nature-based solutions. Woodland is very good at its peak, I believe, around 30 years old, in how much carbon it can pull in. So for 2030 targets, tree planting isn't going to help. It's going to help beyond that point. So we must be doing it, but you can see my point, emissions reduction has to come first and foremost and run alongside. I like to give take-home messages because I know there's a lot of information coming your way. So take-home messages number 1 and 2, natural solutions are not enough on their own, number 1, and that we must protect those existing habitats and carbon stores. Coming back to trees a minute, this is our group of volunteers working on the River Cober, and they've put a couple of thousand trees in over the last 2 years. The reason this is, you've seen this already, but just to remind you, why the interest in trees? Why are the different political parties competing on who can plant the most trees? It's there at the top of that graph. The 30-year-old mixed native woodland, very good at sucking in carbon, photosynthesis in the trees, drawing out the carbon dioxide and storing it in the wood. That's why there is so much interest. In Cornwall, we've got the Forest for Cornwall initiative, and that's is aiming to plant 8,000 hectares of trees in Cornwall by 2030. So a lot of interest in tree planting, understandably. This is one of our nature reserves over in southeast Cornwall on the Woodland Valley. I wouldn't encourage more tree planting here because this is already a good habitat. It's a mosaic of rough grassland and scrubland. So that will be supporting a huge bunch of wildlife already. If we plant more trees in there, sooner or later we'll have a closed canopy, it will shade out the grassland, and all the species that are relying on that open area will be gone. So we do have to be careful about where we put trees, more on that in a minute. These mosaic habitats are delivering nature-based solutions of all kinds. Okay, it might not be the top habitat for carbon sequestration, but down the hill from there is the Woodland Valley. This is protecting that from surges of water after heavy rain, so it can help with flood alleviation. The soil there is building up carbon, and any agricultural pollutants can get slowed or stopped before they reach the river. So just an example of how some habitats are delivering a whole number of different advantages, not just carbon storage. Here's one of our local peatlands. This is, again, one of our nature reserves, Bostrays Bog. There's significant peat on Bodmin Moor, but we've also got around the rest of Cornwall valley wetlands where there are fen peats. So there's lots we can be doing to restore these peatlands. It's not just all about the uplands, although they're perhaps the more obvious places that are degraded. This is a fascinating place. I'm going this evening to take a walk around this site. This is Woodland Valley near Laddock, not far from Truro. And a very observant amongst you would spot a pile of sticks just across the water on the right-hand side, a big heap of sticks. That's a beaver lodge. We have beavers now in various locations in Cornwall, within enclosures. And these are a fascinating potential nature-based solution. Here's one of the Cornwall beavers. That's the original female that we put in, not looking very happy about having her bramble dinner interrupted. The reason beavers are interesting is because they do this. On small streams where the water depth is not great enough for them to feel safe and for them to get access to their plant food, they will build dams. And this is where it gets interesting. We've got Exeter University working with us at Laddock, and they're measuring the flow of water in and out from this site. And after heavy rainfall, the flood peak is reduced by over 30%. So people living in Laddock that does suffer from flooding, that's quite significant. They're also in dry conditions. Now the beavers have created this wetland, brand new wetland. It's soggy, even during the drought conditions in April, still very wet underfoot in the beaver enclosure. And this is just from one family of beavers. So they can help to keep the river flowing in low flow. They can help protect the wildlife and people downstream after heavy rainfall. So there's an adaptation towards climate change. They're ticking that box. We're also creating new waterlogged soil, which will be a carbon store in itself. And crucially for us as Cornwall Wildlife Trust, they're creating new habitats and linking habitats. We've got a willow tit population now at the farm. It's the most westerly population of that very rare and declining bird. Breeding grass snakes are back. Bat numbers have gone up. Amphibian numbers are up. Small mammal numbers are up. They truly are a keystone species, encouraging other species to come back. So we've really got it all, I think. So really interesting potential nature-based solution. We just need them not in fences anymore. Perhaps we need them in controlled, well managed populations, but beyond the fences, I think. This is from Idaho, so I've just leapt several thousand miles. This is where a wildfire has gone through. That's a beaver territory that's still green and not been damaged. There's a lot of interest in the States for getting beavers in to help restore rivers and bring the fish populations back, but also as a potential to stop the spread of wildfire. That might not feel relevant right now for us in Cornwall, but that's one of our nature reserves in February that got set alight. There's another one, Bartini Castle, a couple of months ago. So wildfire is an issue for us in Cornwall. So it's perhaps not as irrelevant as you first might think. We have to be looking out at sea as well, as when we're thinking about nature-based solutions. A lot of sediments in the marine environment are an important store of carbon. The ones we're really interested in when we're talking about blue carbon are, again, where we need photosynthesis happening. If we want to be sucking down carbon dioxide, it's got to be where the plant life is. So the interest in blue carbon is around these two habitats. Apologies, the top photo isn't very good. That's a salt marsh. And the bottom one is eelgrass. That's a marine flowering plant that we get in shallow waters, and we get it a lot around the south coast of Cornwall. Both of these very good at sucking down carbon dioxide and storing it. I mean, the eelgrass is surprisingly good at storing carbon, but it doesn't look very much there, does it? And there's quite big gaps between it. It almost looks quite flimsy. But below the surface there is a whole network of rhizomes. There's a lot of material that we can't see. And again, these help with protecting coasts from storm events and so on. So a lot of interest in blue carbon. And there are some wildlife trusts, like Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, are actually planting eelgrass on one of their nature reserves that's got some coast on it. We're looking at what we could do down here in Cornwall. There's a lot of research going on, even things like changing some of the mooring systems for yachts and boats so that chains don't drag on the ground. There's potential for restoring eelgrass just by doing something as potentially straightforward as that. So that this is a big area of interest at the moment for us and others in Cornwall. Not a good photo again, but this is to just talk about agricultural soils. And you can see how, I hope you can see that's compacted and there's water standing on that. It's an area that just wasn't farmed well. We do a lot of farm advice, trying to improve soil condition and improve, which is advantageous for the farmer as well. And trying to get cover crops in so that we don't leave areas bare like that to lose the carbon, lose the soil. So I think it's perhaps maybe underestimated the impact we could have if we could make better soil management. 75%-ish of Cornwall is in productive farming. That's a lot, small changes over large areas. That's my take-home message number 3, that other natural solutions are available. I can understand the interest in tree planting, something we can all, it's tangible, we can all have a go at it, but we need to be thinking about those other things too. Then coming back to trees just a minute for my last little bit. These are some acorns that I grew in some Tetra packs. They made quite good plant pots. They're still going 2 years on. They'll be ready to plant out this winter. Having said that, we shouldn't forget the shrubby species, because these have huge value as for wildlife. With acorns, because then they can create a natural tree guard, and this is what happens in some of the rewilding projects. They're seeing this. It just said my internet is unstable. I'm just going to keep going. I hope that you can hear me. I haven't got many more slides. This is an example from upcountry. I believe it's Cumbria. This is where tree planting can go wrong. This is why there is nervousness amongst nature conservationists about the frenzied tree planting. These were put in by an NGO. Then it was made, they were and it still is. So we really need to know what we're planting into. This is an aerial photo of some of the planting we did in the River Coba. Yes, we are using plastic guards. Sometimes the farmers want to see, they don't want to leave it to natural regeneration. They want to see that impact. But this is a carefully chosen site. It is not species rich. That planting will have added benefits of slowing the flow of water through there and trapping agricultural pollutants. So when sites are carefully chosen, tree planting absolutely has its place. This was a bit of woodland that I visited recently, and I suspect they've had a woodland grant of some kind, which encouraged them to replant. And you can see the replanting that's gone in. But again, the eagle-eyed amongst you, in the front right, just outline it there, is an oak that has grown up very well, thanks very much, all by itself. So natural regeneration is something we should be considering. It doesn't work everywhere if there's not a local seed source. This is a low carbon, very natural way of getting new tree cover. Here's an example of natural regeneration again. This is up on Bodmin Moor. If you look at the land in the foreground there, that you can see a Cornish hedge going down the middle. On the left-hand side, it's very bare, where the grazing pressure is very high. On the right-hand side, where the grazing pressure is lower, has been some regeneration of some of those thorny species. So I'd put money on the site on the right being much more biodiverse than the site on the left. So just something as straightforward as relaxing grazing pressure, which is one of these rewilding type principles, could get that extra tree cover without, oh, sorry, someone's trying to call me on. Right, there we go. Without any planting and with little expense as well. Nearly there. So my last take-home message, that tree planting needs ecological know-how. Just might need to get a bit of specialist input before we reach for the spade. But yeah, it's something we can all get involved in. So perhaps get out there this autumn and gather some seed cells. I shall stop there. Thank you.
Cheryl, thank you very much indeed. It's so difficult, isn't it, with our various problems with our broadband, but you came over very well and we got it very well. The challenge that we face is so huge, but these nature-based solutions are fantastic, and it's so good for us to get a better handle on what it's all about. So thank you so much to you and to Mel. Now we can move to questions. I'll start the ball rolling here. I see we only have one so far in Q&A. So come on, folks, get those questions in. And I just want to start the ball rolling with two. One to you, Cheryl. I saw on one of your first slides where you had your frog's head on, and there was the placard, "Let's make the environment act the bee's knees." So my question to you is how helpful is the Environment Bill as it stands on nature-based solutions? And also a more general question to the both of you. Going away from here, I'm very keen on action. So what are the key things that you would want us to go away from here to do? Now, it might be to go away and lobby Derek, say this is what we want. Then again, it might not. So say over to you with both those questions.
Thanks, Julia. The Environment Bill is an interesting one. I think the answer is it's all coming down to the detail. When you look, the talk around it and what we've been told by government is that it will be a landmark bill to turn the tide on nature's decline. So that sounds good. Transform the way we manage waste, protect precious water resources, and improve water quality. So it's being talked up well by government. It sounds good, but it's all coming down to the detail. A word here or there change can make a huge difference. We've been told that there'll be a species decline target, an actual legally binding target to hold governments to account, to make sure we do reverse decline. But now there's a lot of arguing about whether that's strong enough. I would encourage you all to follow Richard Benwell on Twitter, Wildlife and Countryside Link, because they have some excellent briefings on the detail of that bill. So it's well worth a look. That's Richard Benwell and Wildlife and Countryside Link. But
How do you spell Benwell, please?
Benwell, B-E-N-W-E-L-L.
Okay.
Or just do an internet search for Wildlife and Countryside Link. That's all. The Wildlife and Countryside Link is a coalition of numerous different organisations coming together on this. I don't know if Mel has anything else to add to.
Yes, just very briefly, I guess 2 points. One is that on that target, absolutely, as you say, Cheryl, the wording is so important. And at the moment, although we'd hoped it would be the target that you mentioned would be like the equivalent of net zero is for climate change, you know, it'd be this binding target for halting the decline in species. At the moment, the government, the language only commits the government to furthering the objective of halting declines, which you can hear is just not as substantive and as biting. So yeah, absolutely. I think there was a lot of disappointment among NGOs on that. And yes, Richard was a great voice for us on it. And I guess the other thing that we really need the Environment Bill to do for us is just to really ensure very robust protections for existing sites and for the Office of Environmental Protection to really have teeth in enforcing that, which speaks to the point that both Cheryl and I were making around protecting what we have.
That's very
Cheryl,
helpful.
back to you on what people should leave here with.
Action. Well, I guess we should be thinking emission reduction first and foremost. We're doing a lot of thinking on that at Cornwall Wildlife Trust, and how we can reduce our emissions and get to net zero by 2030. So as individuals, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people watching are already doing this. But I think one of the easiest ones is just we're consuming too much stuff collectively. So but I don't want to start preaching to you all about that, but if we can reduce consumption of stuff, and we are consumers of local sourcing, it's the kind of things we've been thinking about for a long time. So there's all that emission reduction side of things. What can we all do for nature-based solutions? Well, obviously we can get involved in tree planting. There will be a consultation at some point from government on beaver reintroduction. So I know it's a pet topic of mine, but you can look out for that and respond positively to government when that consultation comes out.
Okay, anything to add, Mel?
Yeah, I mean, Cheryl's covered some really good ones there. I think I would add, I mean, Julia, you mentioned about lobbying MPs. Yep, absolutely do that on all of this. But actually, I think it's really important that we have conversations with our peers about this stuff. So it's often very challenging to have conversations with people around lifestyle choices, although those, as Cheryl says, those lifestyle choices are extremely important. But actually, with nature-based solutions, there's a lot of inspiring stuff that we can share, a lot of great stories about sites that are local to us, even stuff people can do in their own gardens through, you know, a bit of wildlife gardening, allowing natural regeneration, you know, kind of increasing the vegetation in their gardens, just kind of encouraging people to have those conversations, share those stories, get inspired. Still, as a society, we socially often shy away from talking to our friends and colleagues who are perhaps not the very interested folk that I think are gathered here today. I'm pretty sure that everyone here is committed to the climate change agenda. It's often awkward having those conversations with people who aren't really connected to it, but I'd really encourage you all to do that. And actually, I think the way to tackle nature and climate together has some great stories. So that would be one thing. Definitely do that to your MPs, because they do have a lot of power over all this stuff. And definitely don't buy compost containing peat would be the last one I'd add.
That's great. Thanks very much. Pippa, over to you for the next question. Yes. Can't hear.
We've just been talking about peat. I would just like to read out B. Coombs's question. And I know that B lives on the Isles of Scilly. I have an allotment and it's currently full of bees, and I try to consider nature when gardening my plot. Have you any advice I can share with fellow gardeners beyond the don't use peat, herbicides and pesticides?
Yep. There's the 5 biggies, to see if I can remember them, for getting wildlife into gardens and other spaces. Trees and shrubs is the first one. There was a bit of work looking at what actually makes a difference in a garden. Trees and shrubs, which most people have already. That's all about 3D structure, so getting a variety of structures. Having a compost heap is a great wildlife habitat in itself, and most people have got them already. Log pile is great. Having some kind of pond, even if it's an upturned dustbin lid filled with water. And long grass areas. If you can bear to have some areas of long grass, that's so valuable for wildlife. It'll need clipping once a year and raking off. So don't do more than you can handle. But those 5 things, and as a general principle, being more untidy. Nature needs chaos, it needs mess. Think of it as complexity. I'm trying to get away from the word untidy and think complexity, because that's what the wildlife needs.
Thank you, Cheryl, very much. Julia, you're going to do the next one.
Okay. This one is from Jonathan Howe, saying, I'm wondering about how we can be most effective in increasing biodiversity in urban areas. Would it be useful for local authorities to commission a survey and plan that could then act as a basis for their future decision making? And what sort of organisation might carry out such work on behalf of a council?
Having a plan is a great idea, so you can do an audit of what you've got already and then come up with ideas for enhancement. There's a lot of this going on already in Cornwall. Cornwall Council are very behind bringing biodiversity back to urban spaces. They've got projects in some of their parks and open spaces to bring wildlife back. So we've got the expertise here. There are environmental consultancies that can give you that advice. We have one at Cornwall Wildlife Trust as it happens, but others are available. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. Take the lessons from the people that are already doing it. But if you want to get specific advice, then find yourself an ecological consultant.
Can I just say, having watched the CCC webinar this morning, there's great worry about overheating of houses as generally the climate warms up. And I know there's an awful lot that can be done with greening up cities and sort of growing creepers up the sides of houses and things. Is this something that can be done in terms of greening up urban environments? Do you have a view on that?
Yes. I'm sure it can. Not an area of expertise of mine. I don't know if Mel has any more. But yeah, it's being tried and tested, isn't it? There's so much good practice out there. We just need it to become mainstream, not novel. Right.
Well, shall I just read Virginia Davis's question out, because she has to go in a minute? Are you hopeful about the forthcoming changes to subsidies in agriculture? She says, and it's a question for Mel. You're already typing an answer.
It's okay. I saw that she had to go, so I started to type an answer, but thank you for spotting that. So I'll offer an answer now. Yes, very hopeful, but concerned that the opportunity is taken advantage of by government. So as we leave the common agricultural policy, as we leave Europe, which did so much to damage nature across our landscape, we have the opportunity to come up with new UK policy, and the current policy proposes money being spent not on subsidising food production, but also on producing food, of course, but allowing public money to be spent on other goods such as nature and climate. Now, that's a really exciting opportunity, as long as DEFRA and government make good on that. So we're seeing some real progress and opportunities through the more ambitious components of the schemes, which are environmental land management schemes. But the baseline of what every farmer has to do is not very ambitious at all. And that's really disappointing. What we would like to see is a much higher baseline, so that all farmers, in order to receive payments, have to take more action to do things like, planting more hedgerows, or exploring how to plant, trees and crops together, for example, or conserving their soils. So yes, we need that baseline to be raised, but we are seeing some good options in the kind of higher tiers that farmers can apply for too. Hopefully that answers your question, Virginia.
Okay, we have two questions here from Diana Wilson. One we'll put to Mel and Cheryl, and the other one is more addressed to Derek, so I'll just leave that out, and it's there for him. The question from Mel and Cheryl is, do you want us to put pressure on our parliamentary representative to strengthen the Environment Bill by supporting the CEE Bill, which concentrates on nature but also puts climate change at the heart of commitments? So that's the one for answer, and the statement phrases the other question was, in the light of the recent statement by the Climate Change Committee showing how frustrated they are by the absolutely illogical lack of sufficient action by government, they said that there was a willful reluctance by ministers to factor in adaptation into their policies. So I'm asking you, as my representative in Parliament, to support the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee. So that's there as a statement. But to say, Mel and Cheryl, would you like to take the first question?
Mel go on, Mel, you go for it.
Yeah, okay.
Closer to the policy than me. My last when I looked at the CE bill and looked at what our national organisation was talking about, the focus was to stick to trying to influence the agriculture bill and the environment bill. But I'm sure you'll know more, Mel.
Yeah, I mean, Rspb's position is the same, not because there isn't some fantastic stuff in the CEE bill. It's really ambitious, and it's, if government committed to do that, that would be amazing. However, honestly, I think it's pretty radical for where our current government is at, and therefore we have been focusing more of our attention on the legislation that government have been bringing forward, which is the Agriculture and Environment Bill. But I mean, anything to put greater pressure, I think using the CE bill as leverage is great, and using the kind of momentum around that is really important, because ultimately some of the goals for nature and climate in that would achieve us an awful lot more.
Henry, did you have something you wanted to say about that? I noticed you were typing an answer.
Sorry, Pippa, I was answering various other questions.
Okay, I may be misreading this, but did you have something to say on Diana's questions?
No, I've already answered them privately, so that's okay. Thanks, Pippa.
Pippa, do you want to do what is, I think, the final question?
Rowena Swallow. We're a community interest company in St Ives, supporting and representing the interests of the whole parish, including both the urban areas and the most rural parts, such as the Lant Downs and Hallstown. Our enterprise business plan is centred around environmental sustainability and resilience. What would you say should be our action planning priorities?
Gosh, that's quite a big question. I think it's one I'd need to know a little bit more about what you were doing. There's a very interesting project called the TEVI project, which is run by Exeter University. We're a delivery partner along with Cornwall Council. That's looking at how businesses can work to grow the environment, so to get new habitats and grow biodiversity, but at the same time looking at being more circular, looking at circular economy. So that's a really interesting place to start. And TEVI might even be able to give you some advice, because there's various people that go out and work with small to medium enterprises. So rather than even try and answer your question properly, I'm encouraging you to get some advice from elsewhere. It's a bit of a cop-out, sorry.
Can I just ask an idiot question? There's all this wonderful work that needs to be done. Where is the finance and the capacity going to come from? Is there grant aid on a scale adequate to make a significant difference? How is it physically going to be managed on the ground?
That's a very big question. So I'll come at it, hopefully Cheryl will come in with some further ideas, but I'll come at it from the climate change perspective. So I mentioned the net zero review that government is doing, how it can meet its net zero targets, and the importance of looking at the role that nature can play within that. So that piece of policy will be preceded by a review by the Treasury, looking at the costs of getting to net zero. So that hopefully that report will go a little way to answer the cost question as to where the money's going to come from in the land sector. So the government has invested £640 million in a Nature for Climate Fund, which is not a small amount of money, but it's also not a large amount of money given the scale of the problem and the scale of what we see government spending on other, I would argue, less worthwhile things. So there's definitely still is a big investment gap. And I think a couple of years ago, some people were highlighting, including the journalist George Monbiot, that I think nature could provide around a third of the solution, but is only 2% of the spending globally goes on nature protection for climate change. So there's definitely some real challenges there around the capacity to deliver it. That's another really interesting angle to think of. So you might remember my slide around the green recovery, where I had all of the different things that nature can deliver for us, and as a reason for investing in nature. Well, around that time we were looking at the cost benefits from investing in nature and the opportunities for jobs from nature restoration. So Rspb has done a piece of work which looks at, for every pound spent, you get I think it's around a fourfold benefit from, I'm doing this from memory, so I can definitely share the actual figures with anyone who's interested, but a fourfold return from woodland, a twofold return from peatland, and a 1.5-fold return from coastal restoration. And it also looked at the numbers of jobs that could be associated with those. So we could actually have a kind of nature task force, thus addressing kind of a whole range of problems, employment problems, physical and mental health challenges that the population as a whole is facing, ecosystem restoration, climate challenges, by investing in this sort of nature workforce. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for that. It was supported by Wildlife and Countryside Link, the coalition that was mentioned earlier. But yeah, government needs to invest in direct investment in the right way. And Julie, just whilst I have the floor, just to highlight, there's about 3 more questions in the chat rather than the Q&A box that we might want to pick up on as well. Okay, that's fine. We'll go to those in a moment. I'll just take the Rupert Manley one in the Q&A. And this, I think, is partly has been covered to a degree by Cheryl already. When is scrub going to be given the recognition it deserves as a crucial part of the biodiversity matrix and afforded appropriate protection in planning regulations rather than being seen as wasteland?
Oh, I'm with you there on the benefit of scrub. Maybe we should just call it something different. But then again, on some nature reserves, we do take it back and try and control it because of its mothering other habitats. This is where rewilding is a really interesting concept, because where we've got big sites like that Hellman Tour Nature Reserve, if we can plug in some species that are now missing, then they can create that nice dynamic mosaic of habitats for us without us going in there with chainsaws. So on large areas, that's something of big interest. In terms of it being protected and planning, I don't know, but just raising the awareness of its importance. And we're not trying to get rid of scrub, but we want that dynamism and that mosaic. And if there's new ways of getting that mosaic, I think that has to be a good thing.
Julia, there's another question from Rupert Manley in the chat, in which he asks, how can the government rationalise the apparent relaxation of planning rules with less rather than more ecological assessments and mitigation measures, with the drive to restore nature and enhance biodiversity? And it was interesting that this morning Robert Gendrick came in for a particular rap on the knuckles for not taking ownership in terms of supporting local government in pressing forward with their net zero plans. So just be interested to hear what the speakers have to say about that. I'm still surprised by this nature versus development, that it's still an issue, because if you approach development in the right way, you find the least sensitive sites, you plan your development well, you look at where of the site you've got left, which bits are best for wildlife, then plan your development around that to retain those and link them. A developed site, if you're building on a silage field, the development afterwards could even contain more wildlife than it did at the beginning. So this whole nature versus development thing, it shouldn't be an issue if we're choosing the right sites. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So I don't know that it really is, that wildlife creates the delay that people think. If you follow the process in the right way, get the right advice, plan the development with wildlife in mind from the beginning, it doesn't have to be an issue. So it still persists, this idea that nature gets in the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. So our Rspb has always absolutely supported this strategic spatial approach that Cheryl just outlined. I think at the moment businesses are still led by profit rather than nature considerations. I think Rupert makes a really important point. I don't think there is a way of rationalising those two things, and that actually we need some stronger regulation and enforcement of that regulation, for example, by this Office of Environmental Protection that's being brought in under the Environment Bill, to make sure that that wildlife is taken into account at the beginning, and as Cheryl says, it's perfectly possible to avoid those conflicts.
Thank you. Next question is for Elsa Johnson. In the last webinar, George Eustace said it would be 2024 before there is a ban on the sale of peat in garden centres, and the use of peat in food production, mushrooms, etc., would take even longer. How can we speed that up?
People power. Why do we need to wait for a ban? If we stop buying it and encourage other people to stop buying it, then it won't be dug out the ground.
Yeah, 100%. I would say also to use the UN climate, the fact that we're hosting a UN climate conference in November as leverage to embarrass the government and say, how on earth can we be asking other countries to manage their land in a way that addresses climate change when we're burning and digging up our own peatlands, which are huge carbon stores? I mean, it is really embarrassing. It's a reputational risk issue to the UK as COP president. And yeah, absolutely, we should all take that action ourselves and support the Peat Free April campaigns where there's a real push on this. And also, if you have a look online, there is one of my friends manages it. There's a website which lists all the peat free nurseries in the UK. So particularly if you're ordering online, if you're struggling to find stuff that's peat free and you're just like, oh, I really want this plant, but I can't guarantee that it's peat free, then check out that list because that's super helpful.
Yeah, the Tevi project has been working on this as well, and they're supporting a nursery in North Cornwall, whose name I can't remember, I'm sorry, but there is at least one peat-free nursery in Cornwall. And then when you're buying from places like that, make sure you then tell your local garden centre why you're not buying from them.
Good point. Pippa, do you want to take one of the... I think there's two more questions.
Let me have a look. I've been looking in the chat.
I think there's one by Virginia Davis and another one from Elsa.
Well, I don't seem to have those. I've got one from Diana Wilson, which we've answered.
All right. Well, I'll just...
So you do them because I can't find them.
Those two as the last two questions then. Virginia Davis says, are you hopeful about... I can't read my own writing now.
Yeah.
Are you kind of about forthcoming changes to subsidies in the agriculture?
Have we done that one?
We did that
forthcoming
one.
Changes. Say again.
We've done that one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
A bit further back.
Sorry. Are there other flood alleviation projects in Cornwall apart from the introduction of otters? This is Elsa Johnson.
That would be the introduction of beavers. We've got plenty of otters already. Yes, well, there's a lot of work. As I said, tree planting is being used in some locations. There's a lot of work on just better soil management. Just getting soils into better condition can have a huge impact on flood alleviation. They're the two main ones that I can think of, but there's a lot of people working on this. And the great thing is about some of these natural solutions is if you're trying to tackle one thing and it has a positive impact on all of those other ones. So we're working with lots of farmers, for example, with South West Water to prevent agricultural pollution getting into various drinking water sources. So the advice that we're giving to those farmers to reduce their fertiliser bill also has a knock-on improvement to the soil, which then can help after heavy rainfall to hold the water in the soil. So it's all connected. So there's a lot of positive work going on. Not everywhere, and again, it's got great examples of it. It needs to be more mainstream, but I think awareness of natural flood management is is huge compared to what it was a few years ago.
Thank you. Jenny, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sorry, our phone is just being answered. But yeah, I would just add, Cheryl, that obviously the statutory authorities lead on a lot of the flood alleviation work in our county. So there's a lot of catchment sensitive farming operations going on, which is led by Natural England. And the Environment Agency have various projects, for instance, in the Newland catchment, Marzion, Hale. So there's a lot of cross-working between NGOs like ourselves and the statutory bodies, but clearly not enough because a lot of the problems still persist. And it's been very clear through the Water Framework Directive that most of the regulations to protect our catchments, either from diffuse pollution or flood incidents, you know, has been inadequate largely. So we need better regulation of those things. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Jen. Well, I think that we've come through all the questions that we've had, which was great. We've had some jolly good questions. So thank you very much for those.
Julia,
a huge thank you.
We've just got a question from Maggie Freegard, which we would have time to answer.
Yeah, go for it. Final question. Yeah, go, Pippa, you take it.
Final question then. Can the Rspb and wildlife trusts lend their support to more education of the general public and schools by the government, probably cross-party, so they appreciate the need for a change to farming and food and more space for nature on land and sea?
Yeah, it's all, that does unfortunately all come down to funding. We'd love to do more education work and more work in schools, but trying to fund it's tricky. So we will do it as part of funded projects. But yes, absolutely, but we need the resource being charitable.
That's a whole new debate, and it's one that the WI is going to try and get into its resolutions process, because clearly these kids need to come out of school knowing what the issues are.
So I would just agree with Cheryl there, Pippa. A lot of our education in Cornwall, our outreach programmes with the schools has been either led by funding through stewardship, agricultural stewardship, or various trusts that have donated money towards that. But as a national organisation, we do have classrooms which schools do visit to learn about those sorts of things, but it'd be much better if it was in the curriculum, because trying to get it in a cross-curricular subject is much more difficult than having it as a core curricular activity, as you probably know.
Well, maybe that discussion will be for next month then, so you'll all have to come. Sorry, Julia.
Do you want to add anything now?
Very briefly, just in our HQ team, we do have people working to try and kind of feed stuff into, provide resources and feed stuff into classroom learning. And in terms of climate change, we've contributed to schools packs through the kind of for the Save the Love campaign that I know has been really active in Cornwall. So we have done some of that, but yes, there's a huge amount more to do. I absolutely agree, it's a priority. Resources is a challenge at HQ, just as it is at the operational level. Although I was heartened to hear that there's plans for the natural history GCSE, which would obviously be a big.
Okay, well, I say again, a huge thank you to our speakers. It's been so interesting and informative, really, really helpful. Thank you for all the very good questions. And please come back next month. Pippa, what date was it again when we were talking about?
14th of July, and we'll stick with 4 p.m. for this one, and then we can reconsider for September.
Great. Well, thank you very much.